Hello, everyone. I'm just gonna talk about some upcoming programs. We have next Tuesday, we have again Mr. Dwoskin that will be here in the auditorium and also on Zoom and online. Also, we will have a film screening next Wednesday at 2 p.m. called for National Canadian Film Day. It's going to be called Without Precedent: The Supreme Life of Rosalie Bella. The producer and the director of the movies will be here. And after the movie, there will be a small Q&A session. On April 23rd at 6 p.m., we will have a workshop called Lease Transfers and Rental Increases with Logis Action. So you need to register for that one to attend. It will be in the multipurpose room. And also we have the used book sale, which is very popular here in Cote-Saint-Luc, on April 26th and 27th, which is Saturday and Sunday from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. And on 4th of May, we will have Jane's Walk, where they will talk about Cavendish, the history of Cavendish. Here's Mr. Dwoskin.
Thank you so much, Angela. It's so nice to see her in person and to see you in person, because it's so much harder to teach looking at a screen than it is to see live people. I would like to add two more announcements that I just saw today. One is May 1st. This May 1st is the Israel Day is going to be celebrated. And it's going to be in McDonald Park, which is, the park on the corner of between Clanranald and Earnscliffe, and corner is between Isabella and Dupuy. So that big park over there, they're going to have the Israel Day celebrations. I think it's at 10:15 in the morning. And the day before that, on April 30th, there's going to be a walk, run, walk, kind of to support, to be supportive, we'll call it like that, of the hostages that are still held in Gaza. And that is going to be, I think, at 1 o'clock or 1:15 from the Y on Westbury. So those are two community events that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. I know that you have all heard that famous Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." And it surely applies to today. And it surely applies to China also, because they're the ones who are living in the most interesting times, as well as pretty well the whole wide world. And whereas the news has just no end of we'll call it important and shocking headlines, it's so hard to figure out where to put the emphasis. Like, what's most important? If you look at today's news and yesterday's news and the day before's news, the stock market has been shockingly down. Today it's a bit up, but that for sure is a shock to many people. Something like $6 to $7 trillion were lost since last week. Now, there's a lot of people who might say, you know what, the stock market is not that important. I don't have shares in stock markets. The stock market is only for rich people. And who cares if they lose a few $1 trillion? So it's a common kind of reaction. And I did see one statistic that said something like 6% of the people in the US own 94% of the stocks. Therefore, if the stock market goes down, it only affects rich people who can afford to lose money anyway. I would say that that is partially true, but it's really only partially true because these measures don't account for a lot of things. Like, for example, when they say that 6% of the people own 94% of the stocks, it's very hard to know how true that is because everybody who has a pension plan and everybody who has investments with a broker or a bank, that bank may be the one holding the stocks, but they're holding it on behalf of you. So it's the 6% is a very kind of shadowy measure because behind that 6% lies hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have some shares or some part of what's being held for them indirectly in the stock market. So that's why I'm saying that it's not really accurate to say that only a few people are affected. The stock market is really widely held by lots of people directly and indirectly, and especially by people who tend to be older. So in other words, yeah, it's, probably true that of young people 18 to 34 years old, there's probably not a lot of them who own shares directly or indirectly because they're studying, they're working, they don't have extra money to spend. They're busy trying to build their futures and maybe save up money for a house. But for people in the older generations who have had a lifetime of savings, indirectly or directly, some of those savings are in the stock market one way or another. And you might say, well, for example, I only invest in the Canadian stock market, but really the whole world's markets are being shaken to the core by this. Whatever happens in one country happens in another country. Just to give you an idea, some of the very largest Canadian companies, their stocks are sold both on the American exchange and on the Canadian exchange. So even directly, Canadian companies are affected. So let's just talk for a second about what happens when the stock market goes down. Let's say, for example, like in other words, how does it affect affect people? So there's so many different ways that they're affected. One is psychologically. So obviously, if you're somebody who does have an investment, and let's say your investment that you have is $100,000, and then you look, what you say is fine, okay, it's a decent amount of money. I can buy a lot of things with that. But then you look at your portfolio 2 weeks later, and it says it's $80,000. Okay, so that means you've lost 20%. You still have $80,000. It's still enough to cover emergencies. It's enough to cover trips. It's enough to cover certain things. And theoretically, that money is supposed to be making money for you. In other words, if you make 4% on that money, so say 4% of $100,000 is $4,000, but if it's only $80,000, you're only going to make $3,200 on that money, if that's the way it works. So psychologically, you still have money, but you say to yourself, I don't think I'm going to go out and buy a car right now because I might need that money for something else, and I don't want to lose everything that I have on buying a car. So people will automatically, even though you might say that practically speaking, it's only a piece of paper, and what goes down today might go up tomorrow. But the fact is that it's gone down will stop you from making purchases that you might have ordinarily made. So that's that psychological effect, which has a practical effect, as people will just stop buying things. But then what about if you needed that money to really, you needed to come up with some big money by May 1st. You needed that money for a down payment on a house. You needed that money, like I said before, to buy a car. You needed that money for all kinds of things. Well, if you have to cash out at a time when the market is down, you're stuck. But there's even another implication, and that is that, let's say you've got that money, but you borrowed money using that as a security. In other words, you might have applied for a mortgage. You might have applied for a car loan of some sort. You might have applied for a loan to do renovations. And that loan was based on what your net worth is, what you have. But if all of a sudden your net worth drops by 20%, if you've borrowed money, the bank who lent you the money says, wait a minute, you know what? Your net worth isn't what you told me 2 weeks ago. Your net worth is down 20%. So we're not going to lend you as much as we lent you. Or if we already lent you that money, we want you to pay us back so that our lending ratio is the same as it was before. So in other words, if we're going to lend you, say, 60% of your net worth, and your net worth goes down by 20%, well, you have to now pay us back so that your net worth, so that the loan amount is still 60% of your net worth. That's very, very common in business. If you have to take out a loan for business, it's based on what you have and what you could make. So in other words, this kind of drop in the stock market leads to a chain reaction of all kinds of other decisions. So it's impossible for me to talk about current events without talking about the President of the United States, because he's just like takes up the whole room. And it's true that the tariffs that he has announced and continues to announce are something that's there to shake up the whole world. And because trade is such an important part of the world, because no country makes everything that it uses, because countries have to produce things that they sell to other countries, that's what the essence of trade is, that the whole world is shaken up when tariffs are put on goods that are coming into the United States. So, and the president himself has never said, he said clearly so many different things that conflict with each other. And that's what's so frustrating for business people to try to make a decision. So he has said, on the one hand, that he's putting tariffs on Canada and Mexico because illegal immigrants and fentanyl are coming in. Well, suppose illegal immigrants and fentanyl stop coming in. Does that mean that he's gonna get rid of the tariffs? We already know that much, much fewer immigrants are coming in to migrants or illegal migrants are coming into the US because of more strict border surveillance, because Mexico has tried to stop migrants before they get into the United States, because there's almost no illegal migrants who come in from Canada, and there's almost no fentanyl that comes in from Canada. So he started off by saying, that's what I'm going to do. But then he changed his mind and said, no, tariffs are there to help encourage industry in the United States. So to encourage goods produced in the United States. And he says, if I put a tariff on imports, goods that come in from abroad, then companies will be encouraged to make things in the US. This kind of very short-sighted idea has been tried before and has failed before. The depression that some of you may remember, or your parents for sure remember, if you lived in America or Canada in the 1930s, or your parents did, and you know for sure that this idea was put into effect and turned into a world recession, a world depression. And there's no reason to think that this is not going to happen again, especially because the amount of tariffs that have been put on goods coming into the US is bigger than the tariffs that were put on in 1930 in the United States. And every single economist who has written about this has turned and pointed to the 1930s recession as being partly caused by the tariffs that the United States put on, because it meant that if goods coming into the US would cost more, people would buy less of them. And therefore, people abroad would make less of them. So people abroad would lose their jobs. And then, of course, if they put counter tariffs on what's coming out of the US, people in the US would lose their jobs. And though it would become a vicious circle, so that if people lose their jobs, they don't buy local things. The people who make those local things, they lose their jobs. And it just goes on and on and on and on. To the point where in the United States, during the height of the Depression, some of the unemployment figures were over 20% in some places. So why are tariffs such a bad idea? So I was going to say that the other motivation for the United States to put tariffs on is, he says, well, other countries have tariffs on our goods. Therefore, if they charge us tariffs, we should charge them tariffs. But then that's not the only motivation, because there's many countries in the world who don't have tariffs, and he's still charging tariffs on them. So then he says, well, if a country sells us more than we buy from them, they're cheating us, they're robbing us. And therefore, we have to stop that robbery by making sure that no country sells more to the US than we buy from them. Now, this is the most ridiculous proposition that the president has made. It doesn't work that way. I mean, the world trades with each other for one basic reason. The reason is that people produce things in one place that people need in another place. That people produce things cheaply in one place that people need in another place. If Canada, for example, said, you know what, we are not going to import anything from the rest of the world. We're going to make everything ourselves here. Some people might say, wow, what a great idea. Other people would say, what a stupid idea. Because we cannot make coffee, we can't make bananas, we can't grow chocolate, we can't grow coconuts. We could. If we wanted to, we could. The cost would just be huge, because if you go down to the Montreal Botanical Gardens, you'll see coffee plants there, you'll see banana plants there, you'll see papaya plants there. But at what cost? You know, the cost would be huge, because you have to heat you'd have to heat huge sections of Canada to grow oranges and everything else that we can't grow here. They don't grow coffee in the United States, except a tiny amount. And they don't grow cocoa in the United States, except for a tinier amount. But there's tariffs on those things coming into the United States, meaning a tariff is a tax. A tariff means that an importer has to pay that money. It's not the exporting country that pays a tariff. It's the importing country that pays a tariff. Meaning, in the United States, anybody who imports anything is going to have to pay a tariff. So therefore, the choices are either he has to raise prices to cover the tariff, which is the most common thing, or he has to make less money, less profit, in order to keep prices down. Obviously, if he makes less profit, at some point he can make no profit. Or even if he makes less profit and he still is making a profit, therefore the amount of taxes he has to pay to the government on his profits has to go down because he's making less of them. So there is no possible way. And even, for example, if the exporter says, you know what, I can manage to charge you a little bit less so that you could still import my goods. So I'll make less profit. That means I'll pay less taxes in the country that I'm in. And therefore, if I'm paying less taxes, that country will be poorer. And it means all in all that the people won't be able to import anything from the US because they just can't afford to do it. So what's the reason why there's some countries in the US who sell so much more to the US than they buy from the US? So let's take a look at the example of two examples. The countries or places that got the highest tariffs in the world from Mr. Trump. Anybody know what they are? The places that have got the most tariffs, the biggest percentage of tariffs. I'm not counting today, because today I think he said, oh, I'm doubling the tariffs on China to 104%. But, you know, I don't know if he means it, if he said it, if it's going to happen. But let's forget about today, because the 104% would just make anything coming in from China so unbelievably expensive. And by the way, all of us, all of you here, including me, if you look on the back of anything you buy, very often it says made in China, right? Whether it's furniture, whether it's electronics, whether it's clothes, pretty well, most of the things that you will find in Dollarama are made in China. So imagine if all those things had to double in price, how that would affect, you know, our budgets. It would be a huge boost to inflation. It would mean that things would cost more, so inflation goes up. And when inflation goes up, obviously you have less money to spend on other things because you have to spend so much for those things. And inflation has its own series of problems, because if people can't afford to buy things, then their standard of living goes down. Then they will demand more wages from their employers. So that means that their employers have to charge more for the things they make here, because the people can't afford to buy things from China anymore. So you can see how this leads to a whole chain reaction of bad things. There's almost no good that comes out of it. Almost no good that comes out of it. Because if there is something good that comes out of it, as far as Mr. Trump is concerned, it is that factories will open in the US to make the stuff that China makes. And therefore that will give jobs to Americans. But here's the problem. Unemployment in the United States and even in Canada is at practically a record low. So there are no workers who are going to work in those factories to make the things that compete with China. Not only that, but the things that will be made in those factories will have to cost much more than the goods coming from China. Otherwise, there's no reason to make the factories, right? So that means that goods that are going to be produced in America will cost far more than the imported version. Otherwise, what's the point? And if they cost far more, it means we will have to pay for all of that. So, and like I said, the factories don't have the expertise to make these things. They don't have the workers to make these things. It takes a very long time to build a factory. The machinery that they would need to make the things comes from abroad anyway. I mean, there's just so many negative factors that you can't find a single positive one. And it just disrupts everything. So let me go back to my question that I had asked. Who is being charged the highest rate of tariffs in the world from the US? Yes, go ahead. Vietnam, not quite, but very high. You're right on the Vietnam, but they're not the highest. the reason that the United States put a high tariff on Vietnam and Cambodia and Thailand is that because the US had previously put tariffs on China, China decided to open factories in Thailand and in Vietnam and in Cambodia to make things with cheaper labor than exists in China and then export those things to the US. So in a certain sense, it's taking jobs from China and putting it in Vietnam, in a certain sense. At the worst of it, is taking boxes of stuff that's made in China and taking a sticker saying made in Thailand and then shipping it from Thailand directly without even opening the box. So that would be a kind of a cheat. But, you know, sometimes desperate times calls for desperate measures. So in order to ensure that that doesn't happen, he just put a high tariff on stuff from Vietnam, saying that, well, you can't just change boxes and send Chinese stuff to the United States. So that's that. But Vietnam is a good guess. I think the Vietnam tariff is at 46%. I think that's what he put on. But there's two very small places, and I mean very small places, that got very high tariffs. One is our neighbor. Who's our neighbor? Who's the country that's closest to us besides the United States? Use your heads a little bit. With France is correct. France is correct. Saint Pierre and Miquelon are the island. It's a department of France. It means it belongs to France. But for some odd reason, Trump decided to charge different overseas departments of France different amount of tariffs. So Saint Pierre and Miquelon got hit with a 50% plus tariff. Now, does Saint Pierre and Miquelon charge the United States a high tariff? Of course not, because it's part of France. And France itself got hit with the whole European Union tariff of 20%, which is extremely high. But for some reason, he liked Saint Pierre and Miquelon so much that he gave them a 50% tariff. So it's the question, as I started to explain, the tariffs are trying to kill two birds. One is to look at what is the United States charged by that country, and most countries, if they're going to charge tariffs, they don't have a blanket tariff like the United States is doing. Everything is going to cost 20% more. Doesn't work that way. Usually a tariff is done on a specific product or a specific, we'll call it a specific product in order to maybe cure two special problems. One is that if the product is being sold in a market below the price that the product is being sold at home, that's called dumping. And in order to stop dumping, you put a tariff on that specific product. So for example, let's say, for example, China is selling, they're not doing this, but let's pretend that China was selling solar panels around the world cheaper than they were selling the same solar panels in China. That would be dumping. And the cure for dumping is to put a tariff on solar panels. See, so that's one reason for putting a tariff on. The second reason would be to protect a local industry of some sort. So for example, let's say the United States was trying to make solar panels, which they were when Biden was in charge. They tried to open up a solar panel industry. They said the solar panels coming from China are so cheap that in order to develop the industry in the US, we have to put a tariff on Chinese solar panels. And so they did. And so that explains the other reason for tariffs. So it's got two separate things. But Trump didn't put any tariffs on industries. He just put tariff on countries. But the other thing he was trying to do was to say, well, let's look at the trade imbalance. Let's look at how much we buy from them and they buy from us. If they buy nothing from us, but we buy a lot from them, then the cure is to put a tariff on their things that come into the US. So let's go back to St. Pierre and Miquelon. What does St. Pierre and Miquelon buy from the US? Not much. It's a small place. They don't buy that much from the US. But what do they sell to the US? They sell a lot. They sell a lot of fish products because that's what the only thing they do in St. Pierre and Miquelon is fish. So if you look at that, you could see this huge imbalance. Let's take the other victim countries. Lesotho. Anybody heard of Lesotho? Everyone been to Lesotho? Anyone know where Lesotho is? Lesotho sometimes it's called. It's a small, very poor country surrounded entirely by South Africa. And what has happened in Lesotho is they have two products, diamonds and jeans. So they make two things. Their wages are so low, the people are so poor, that some clothes manufacturers said, you know what, if we set up factories in Lesotho, we'll be able to ship them out of South Africa to get to the US, and therefore we're able to manufacture our jeans at a low cost. It is also a way of distributing the work to many different countries in case one country has a problem like a civil war or a natural disaster, a flood, a hurricane, a fire. Most clothes are made in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Cambodia, nowadays in Vietnam. But if something goes wrong there, well, we could, make some clothes in Africa and just spread the risk around. So therefore, Lesotho sells a lot to the US, but buys nothing. How come they buy nothing from the US? Because they're so poor, they can't afford to buy anything that the US sells. That's the reason. So what Trump has done is to say, well, that's not fair. We want them to buy more from the US. So therefore, what we'll do is we'll stop them from selling goods to the US. By stopping them selling goods to the US, the people will have even less money. So they won't be able to buy anything from the US if they were buying a little bit before. So the idea that Trump came up with, you might remember he talked about Canada. He says they're ripping us off because we buy more from them than they buy from us. They're cheating. They're stealing our money. But it's not stealing, because when the US buys something from another country, they're getting something in return. They're getting the goods that they bought. It's not like they're stealing. He says it's stealing, but of course, it's ridiculous to think of something like that. Not stealing anything. The US is buying fish from St. Pierre and Miquelon. They're not selling anything to St. Pierre because St. Pierre doesn't need anything from the US, but they're not stealing. St. Pierre is not stealing from the US. They're selling them fish in return for money. If the US could buy the fish cheaper somewhere else, they would. If the US could make so much of their own fish that they didn't need any fish, they wouldn't have to buy anything from St. Pierre and Miquelon. The idea that the United States has to be self-sufficient is this idea of self-sufficiency is an old one. And it's especially one that was developed in the colonial times. So when we had colonial powers in the world, like, for example, Great Britain, France, Holland, Germany, maybe, when there were these great colonial powers, the idea came about that you wouldn't have to buy anything from outside your own empire. That the countries like India could supply the cotton to Great Britain. Great Britain would then make shirts and clothes out of the cotton and then send them back to India and send them back to the other colonies and even send them outside the empire if possible. But there was no need to buy anything from outside the empire because the empire could supply everything. And each of these colonial powers had that same idea. There was a term that was developed for that philosophy. It's called mercantilism. like merchants, mercantilism. And that idea was so strong that they forbade the colonies, say in the Caribbean, to trade with each other. So in other words, a colony that belonged to Great Britain was not allowed to sell to a colony that belonged to France. And at one time, America was a colony and Canada was a colony. And so these countries were not allowed to trade with other places that weren't part of the British Empire. And that led to a lot of frustration because you had to pay more for things than you ordinarily would have had to pay if you could freely trade. And the idea of free trade emerged especially strongly after the Second World War was over. The whole world had changed as a result. The colonies were, colonial empires were all kind of broken up. Great Britain gave up all of its possessions, and Germany lost their possessions, and France gave independence to all of its countries. So this whole idea of having an empire and trading within the empire, it all broke down after the Second World War. And you had free trade. So what's the biggest advantage of free trade? Give me an idea. Why is free trade so beneficial to the average person? Yeah. Right. Not every country can produce every item, but right. So actually the biggest advantage is low prices, right? I mean, think of it. I mean, it even happened to us within our times. Within our times, I mean, unfortunately, Canada and Montreal, we used to have a very strong clothing industry, right? But there was a cost to that. The cost was we had to pay what the prices were charged by the local manufacturers and selling to the local stores, and that was what we paid. We don't realize it. We don't realize that when we started importing clothes from China, or television sets, the better example, even television sets, something that costs more money, a TV set that was made in the US, I mean, it cost a lot of money for us to buy a TV set in those days. Now you could buy TV sets for less than you could buy, I don't know what, anything pretty well. Those TV sets are made in massive factories in Vietnam or in China or in Korea, where they specialized early on in mass producing these complicated things that take a long time to put together. But we benefited from it. We don't realize how much we benefit from trade. We're getting, in a free trade environment, we get the lowest price for everything that we buy. Canada, in each country, sort of produces what they produce well. And they import what they don't produce well or what they can't produce at all. And that is what free trade is there to do. Now, of course, nothing is so simple as that, because you've got all kinds of wrinkles, all kinds of little complications. Like, what if a country like China subsidizes its industries so that, in other words, they give money to the industry so that they could produce cheaper, and then they could control a market? So that's a wrinkle, but that's not a reason to destroy a whole free trade environment. It's a reason that you might need tariffs on specific items that get extra support from a local country. In a practical terms, we can see in history how protectionism and tariffs have, in the long run, caused all kinds of problems for countries. And one of the best things to look at is South America, because in the days in the 1920s and the 1930s, it's so funny, I talk about the 20s, we're in the 20s, but I mean the 1920s and the 1930s, countries like Argentina and Brazil were as rich as Canada and the US. They were as rich as Western Europe. And what happened? You know, they got stuck in one of these sort of protectionistic, my country first philosophies. And they started to overprotect their local industries and charge huge tariffs on goods coming in. And so what happened is that those manufacturers had no competition. And so they produced not good quality products for very high prices. So they certainly couldn't export abroad because of that reason. And the people in their countries experienced inflation because those companies could charge whatever they wanted. Now, let's just go back to, I'm going to go back to two different things. Notice I haven't looked at my notes because I'm just talking, I'm just interested in this particular subject. So let's go back to two things. You know, they say that Canada has a huge trade surplus with the US. First of all, for some crazy reason, the President Trump is only concentrating or looking at goods, actual goods that are produced. But in today's economy, goods are a very small part of what the economy is. For example, if you subscribe to Netflix, if you subscribe to any of the computer services, Apple, Google, I mean, all kinds of these things, not one of these things is a good. Nothing crosses a border when you buy a Netflix subscription. But your money is going from here to the US. So if you don't count services as part of the whole trade arrangement, you're getting a very unfair picture of what trade really is. Because today, for example, if you go to the movie theater and you watch a movie that's made in the US, that money is going to the US. You know, so therefore you've actually bought something from the US, but it wasn't shipped over the border in a truck. It was all done on the internet. So you can't measure today trade by looking at just goods. And if you take the Canada-US relationship and you count services, then we buy much more services and goods from the US than we sell to the US. That's one thing. Now let's look at something else. Let's look at tourism. Tourism is a huge part of the world economy. In many countries, tourism accounts for more than 10% of all their income. And especially, for example, in the Caribbean, I mean, that's all they have. Well, when Canadians go to Florida, where I just came back from, and we spend our money there, that's like exporting, that's like the United States exporting to Canada, because you have Canadians paying for something in the US. He doesn't count that either. And it's such an important part of the economy of so many different countries in the world is tourism. So there is no argument that he could possibly make that the world is taking advantage of the United States. You know, if it's true in a tiny fraction of the issues, like I mentioned, the idea of solar panels being subsidized, you know, in the early days, Japan and Korea, when they started their car companies, Hondas or Kias, those companies were indirectly subsidized by the governments of those countries. They gave them loans on easy terms. They allowed companies to combine to make a bigger company. They did all kinds of things to encourage those industries. But the United States does, of course, exactly the same thing. I mean, they give subsidies to oil companies. They give subsidies to farmers. They give subsidies here, there, and everywhere. Under the green, what's it called? The green initiative that Biden did, he gave $500 billion out to different companies to make green energy and to transform their economies to the green economy. So that's a subsidy. So that in a certain sense is an unfair trade practice because other countries were not able to get that money to do the same thing in the US. So, I mean, it's a complicated matter to figure out what's fair. Then there's no question that the damage that this is doing is going to damage the whole world, and it's going to cause a recession on the one hand and inflation on the other hand, which is a terrible combination. So it's going to cause inflation because prices have to go up. When tariffs are applied, it's a tax, and that tax has to be paid by whoever is buying the goods. So for sure, inflation is going to go up. But at the same time, people will be losing their jobs because, as I said before, when a trade war starts, companies have to shut down because they can't sell their goods abroad. So at the same time, you'll have high unemployment, higher unemployment, and at the same time, you'll have inflation. And that's a very bad combination. But let's get off this here subject for 1 second. I just want to check my time because, sorry about that. Okay. You would think by all that I said and listening to everything around the news that this is the main thing that Trump has done. But it's not. It's not in any way, and it's not even the most important thing that Trump has done. Why do I say it's not important? It's important, but why isn't it the most important thing? Because things that have to do with finance and money balance themselves out one way or another. That's what happens. It has an effect. It has an effect on the people, but it doesn't have an effect on the, let's say, it doesn't have an effect on the fundamental rules by which the country is run. So that's what I'm saying. If you make if you raise taxes or lower taxes, if you raise prices or lower prices, things work themselves out. People change what they buy. I mean, if the idea of Trump is to make things in the US, let's say everything was made in the US, he would have no money. Those tariffs would bring in no money. He's thinking, oh, he's going to have all this money coming into the US that he could spend on all the things he wants to spend on lowering taxes, for example. But if his plan works, there won't be any more tariffs to collect at all. So as I was starting to say that he has contradictory ideas behind these tariffs. One is to collect money, but if it's too successful, he won't collect any money. One is to encourage people to buy things made in the US, but if he destroys economies outside the US, they won't have any money to buy things from the US. So you can see how the things that he thought about to cure with tariffs they're contradictory. If one thing works, another thing isn't going to work. So that's that. But what about all of the other disruptions that he's done? The idea, for example, I mean, without even starting, there's no end to where you can go with this, but to just pick people up off the street and send them to a jail in El Salvador without any kind of hearing, to say to a judge, if you don't rule in my favor, I'm going to have you disbarred. To say to news media, if you don't give me good coverage, I'm not going to allow you to cover anything in the White House. I'll take away your credentials. To tell universities, if I don't like what you're teaching, I'll just take away money from you and make sure that you close down any departments that I don't like. To fire hundreds of thousands of workers in the civil service who are providing services to the country in every which way. All those things I think are far more, we'll call them philosophically important than the idea of tariffs, even though tariffs are getting all the big headlines. Because all of those things fundamentally try to change what the Constitution says in the United States, that you have freedom of speech, that you have freedom of assembly, that you can't just be picked off the street by a policeman and shipped abroad without any hearings or anything like that. Um, of course, to threaten to deport 11 million people who are illegally in the U.S., but who have been there for, many, many years and who have children who are born in the U.S. I mean, all of these things are far more, philosophically dangerous than to change figures on a balance sheet. Because figures on a balance sheet can change back and forth. But the idea of telling a judge, if you don't rule the way I want, I'm going to have you disbarred. To tell a law firm that if you oppose me, I'm not going to allow any other companies to do business with you. I mean, these are fundamentally dictatorship type ideas. And by the way, which country got zero tariffs in this whole? He put tariffs on the whole world, including on islands that don't even have any people. I'm sure you heard of that. Russia got no tariffs, zero tariffs. There's hundreds of millions of dollars of trade between Russia and the United States. How come they got no tariffs? So, I mean, you could see how disruption, how he said, I'm going to shake things up. And people said, yeah, well, we need to shake things up. But people did not appreciate how good the American economy was doing in the last administration. And how do you know that? Well, again, let's go back to the stock market. It was at a record high. Unemployment was at a record low. Inflation was down to the 2% level that it was aimed at after the shock of COVID. So the economy in the US wasn't doing bad at all. Trump said it was doing bad. The people might have felt that their costs that inflation was still there. But inflation, in actual fact, was going down. So if you compare what's coming to what was, in a year from now, people will be saying, my God, things were so much better than they are right now. And even some of Trump's biggest supporters, he's only been in office for 2 months. And people are starting to say, oh my God, look what you're doing. Even some of his big supporters, people who know about the world economy, people who are business people. And of course, he can play favorites. And, Mr. Netanyahu, who showed up in the White House wearing a red tie, the two of them look like twins. If you saw them on TV, they look like Mutt and Jeff. Mr. Netanyahu came to the U.S. to, show his support for Trump. Trump put a 17% tariff on all Israeli goods. Israel, the day before Netanyahu showed up, took all their tariffs away from American goods. And America is Israel's biggest trading partner. They buy more from the U.S. than anybody else, and they sell more to the U.S. than they sell to any other individual country. So did Trump take off the tariffs because Israel took off their tariffs? No. No, because you know why? He doesn't have to. He says his idea is if other countries suffer more than the U.S., then he wins. His idea is there's a fixed amount of money or goods in the world, and whatever I can take from somebody else, they're the losers. And it's us against the world. So another thing that he's done even more consequential than the tariffs is to break the alliances that he's had with the whole world except for the Soviet bloc. At one time, it was very clear, during the Soviet times, it was the free world against the communist world. When the Soviet Union collapsed, those distinctions went down a little bit, but still the European Union and the democratic countries of the world, including the Asian countries like Japan and Korea, were in a sort of a united effort against the upcoming China, who was now sort of taking the place of the Soviet Union as a rival to the United States. And China is today the world's second biggest economy, and the US is the world's biggest economy. And the strange thing is that for many, many years now, the United States has been a quarter of the world's economy. In other words, if you take all the money in the world, a quarter of it is in the US. Even though other countries have expanded faster than the US, like China, the US has still maintained its position as being the largest economy in the world, accounting for a quarter of all the wealth in the world. So it's not as if other countries grow that the US is going to shrink. This is Trump's idea. You know, it's a zero-sum game. If somebody gains something, we're losing something. But everything goes up. If everybody is getting richer, some will get richer faster and some slower, but everybody's getting richer. And, you know, that progress is what allowed China, for example, to emerge as a middle income country, whereas before they were one of the poorest countries in the world. China is now, you know, the leading manufacturer of cars in the world. It has it had the most transformation to green energy of any country in the world. You know, it has advanced so far because it started from nothing. It's still much poorer than the United States, but they're still a middle income country. Now, the reason that the United States in a trade war with China is not going to win is pretty simple, because China doesn't have an electorate that they have to worry about. China doesn't have elections. China is a one-party state ruled pretty effectively by the Chinese Communist Party. And if that party decides something, the country goes along with it. So they don't have to worry like the US is worrying, you know, about, well, what if inflation goes up? What if unemployment goes up? You know, all these things that are going to happen because of these tariffs. China doesn't have to worry about that. They say, yeah, it's going to happen, but we're in control. So if the US wants to bully China, it's not going to work. On the other hand, we've already seen this past week, last week, there were 3 elections in the United States. You might have heard about them. One was for a judge in Wisconsin, Supreme Court, which Elon Musk spent hundreds of millions of dollars. He was handing out checks of $1 million to individuals who would be willing to work on his campaign to win the election. He lost the election. They lost the election 55 to 45, which is a place where, you know, just in November that Trump won 50 plus 1% of the vote. Then in Florida, there were 2 elections to fill House seats in places where the margin of victory last time was 30%. In other words, something like 65 to 35% in the November election. That Trump would have beat, Trump's people beat the Democrats by 30 points. This time they had the elections, but they only won by half, by 15 points. That means they lost half of their voters in this quick 3 months between November and well, not 3 months, but we'll call it 5 months or so, between November and the end of March or beginning of April. They lost half of their majority. So that's a judgment in places where really I was shocked that the Democrats got 42% of the vote in Matt Gaetz's district, which is, any of you know Florida well, you know there's a place called Pensacola in the panhandle of Florida. It's the most conservative part of the state. It has the largest air base in the southern United States. And people who are retired, all military people go and retire down there because, you know, they have friends who are working in the air base because the weather is so good, etc. So this is really, really deep conservative part of Florida. The Democrat got 42% of the vote in that area, in that district. That's, to me, that was a shock. And everyone is predicting, if this continues, of course, that come the 2026 elections, that the Democrats will win control of the House of Representatives. So, you know, that's 2 years away. In the meantime, Trump can do plenty of damage, and he will do plenty of damage even if the Democrats control the House, because everything he does, he says, is a national emergency. It's a national emergency, therefore I have to deport these you know, people he wants to deport. There was a provision in a 1798 law that said in the case of invasion, the president has the right to deport somebody. But he says, well, we're being invaded by migrants. What they meant was in 1798, in case another country would come to invade the US, which could have happened because the US was just such a new country. Britain could have come and reinvaded. But he's bending the law as much as he can to give himself the most possible powers that he can under emergency acts. Even the tariffs are being passed as an emergency. Well, as far as he's concerned, everything is an emergency because the United States, you know, is such a failed country that it takes an emergency to fix it up. You will see that the amount of support he gets is going to be less and less and less as people suffer more and more and more. And the people who are going to suffer the most are the people who voted for him. So why is that? Yeah, because the people who voted for him basically were working class people. And they're the ones who are going to have to pay the most for inflation because they don't have a lot of money to start with. They're the ones who are going to lose their jobs because their jobs are more precarious to start with. And especially the farming community in the United States, which is so strongly supportive of Trump, they are going to lose because other countries will say, we're not buying any American produced farm goods. Soybeans, corn, wheat, you can get those anywhere. You don't have to buy it from the US. You can buy it from Canada. You can buy it from Brazil. You can buy it from Argentina. You could buy it from Australia. All of those countries grow exactly the same thing as the US grows. So why buy from the US? And okay, so you know what Trump says? Well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to support our farmers. What does that mean? We're going to give them money. So what does that mean? What it means is the taxpayer is giving them money. Trump gives nothing. Trump only is a taker, not a giver. So what that means is besides the American people paying more for goods, they're going to have to pay more in taxes to support all those people who have lost their incomes because of countermeasures taken by other countries against the US. So you could see what a mess he's created in such a short time. In record time, he's managed to upset the whole world. And, you know, the only people who are happy with him? Russia. Russia loves him. You know why? Because he said Ukraine started the war. Now, who in their right mind could say that Ukraine started the war when Russia invaded Ukraine twice, in 2014 and in 2022? So how did Ukraine start the war? You know why they started the war? Because he said they started the war. And the saddest part of everything is that the Republican elected leadership, who knows better, just cannot challenge him and tell what the truth is because he's so vindictive. That he is. He's so powerful. That he is. He will undercut, fire, get rid of. He'll do everything he can to any Republican who opposes him. And he did it already. So let me, yeah, just wait one sec. Let me see. Okay. So now I'm, You know, it's too bad I couldn't get to all the rest of the things, but there's always next week. So let's get your questions and comments, especially if you don't understand about tariffs or anything else. Go ahead. Yeah. Can Trump be impeached? Well, they tried it twice and it never worked. To be impeached is a very difficult process. First of all, the start of an impeachment is that the House of Representatives have to vote for an article of impeachment. Right now, the Republicans control the House of Representatives. Therefore, there will never be a vote to start to impeach it. So he can't be impeached. Theoretically, he could be. He was impeached twice, but the Senate in that time didn't vote to confirm what the House did because the Senate was in Republican hands in that time. Well, like I said, in one sense, the most practical thing to stop him would be the 2026 elections that take place every 2 years. And most likely, the Democrats will win control of the House of Representatives, meaning that he won't be able to pass any laws that the Democrats won't agree with. But he's doing things now without passing laws. He says, I don't need laws. I'm the president. I'm going to rule by emergency decree. So therefore, I don't care what legislation is passed because I don't need them. Now, for certain things, he would need them. Let's say to raise taxes or to lower taxes or to pass a budget, he would need the House and the Senate to vote on it. But they already passed the budget. You recall that was a great success of his. They passed the budget for next year. So I mean for the next 2 years. Well, for this 2025 fiscal 25-26, they already passed the budget. And the Democrats voted, some of them voted to pass it because without voting for it, the government would have shut down completely. And there would have been no government services at all. So the Democrats themselves faced the issue, do we oppose Trump on principle and hurt the country? Or do we not hurt the country and allow him to pass the budget? So they were divided. And enough of them voted with the Republicans to pass the budget. Somebody over here had their arm up? Yeah. Right. Well, he actually says, I would like to run for a third term. Now, how could he do that? Let's take the example from Central and South America, tried and true. A tried and true example has been done many times. He's limited to 2 terms. The Constitution says so. So there's 2 possibilities. Number one, he could run for vice president. And then the president resigns. And then by definition, he becomes president because he didn't run for president, but he gets to be president because the vice president resigned. Okay? I believe that that's not allowed in the American Constitution. But a better way would be to have his wife or his son run for president, and they become a sort of a figurehead president, and he says, I'm the real president. You vote for Melania, God forbid, or you vote for Don Jr., or you vote for another of his idiotic relatives, and then I will be the real president. Now, this has been done in South America, and in the Philippines, for example. They love that. That's their system over there. So, that would be the way he would do it. Of course, he'd be 82 years old. So, I'm not knocking seniors. We're all seniors here, but, maybe he'll just get tired after a while and say, the hell with it, Someone else have a question? Let's see. Okay. Somebody answer that phone so then we don't get disturbed. Yeah, well, I'll take them all. Don't worry about it. Yeah. Well, pharmaceuticals are a huge import for the U.S. They import, especially from Europe, a huge amount. I'm sure all of you have heard of these weight loss drugs, Wegovy and Ozempic. They're made in Europe. The U.S. is importing a lot of that. India is the largest maker of generic drugs in the world, and of course, a maker of all the stuff that goes with the drugs, all the needles, injections, and all the other, things like that. Because they have an efficient industry, because they have an educated workforce, because they have a cheap workforce, they're able to dominate in these fields. And yes, the United States has put a big tariff on India. And so drugs in the US will cost much more. Now, can you do it in the US? You're asking the question. You could do anything. It's just a question of the cost of doing it. I mean, they have it all, the system all figured out. I mean, imagine if you had to start from scratch to do anything. Anything at all, let's give you an example of, I don't know what. Let's see, what could we do here? Well, let's take something simple like soup. Okay, you could buy soup from a can, open a can, and heat it up. You can make your own soup. Sure, you could, but you'd have to buy each and every vegetable separately. You'd have to peel them. You'd have to, take them home from the supermarket. You'd have to cut them, wash them, peel them. Then you'd have to cook them. Then you'd have to strain them. Then you'd have to put it in a mixer. I mean, you could do it. You could do it. You could do it. It's just the cost of doing it is just so high that people have decided, you know what, the heck with it. I'll buy soup from Fressers or something like that. Right. Well, that's the idea. Right. Right. That's the idea. We'll call that the rationalization of saying, but that's the rationalization says, well, everybody should be self-sufficient because in case that country stops sending us goods, what are we going to do? And the answer is very simple. A market is a market. There's always a way for you to get something. Let's put it like this. Russia was isolated completely by the US and the Western world over their invasion of the Ukraine. Right? There's sanctions on Russia. You can't trade with Russia. You can't buy from Russia. You can't sell to Russia. Are they collapsing? No, because there's always a way. So I think the argument that we have to be self-sufficient, maybe in a few certain things, a very high-tech computer type applications or defense applications, maybe, but it's only a maybe. Otherwise, it's just an excuse to do production at home at higher costs than you could buy things abroad. And then there's the whole issue of duplication. I mean, if you're already making certain things in some place and they're supplying the whole world, so what's the point of you making the same thing at a higher price? It's already there. Why not make something different? Do something else, do what you're good at. Rather than saying, well, we import so much from India, let's make it all here. Because it's all possible. Nothing is impossible. But it's just the cost of doing it is what makes it so high. And like I said, to me, what the most offensive thing is, you take poor African countries who have really no money. It's the poorest places in the world. They don't have money to buy anything from the US. So the US says, well, look at Madagascar. They don't buy anything from us. Yeah, but they don't have any money to buy things from you. They happen to be the best vanilla growers in the world. What are you going to say? Oh, I'm going to triple the price of vanilla. So what's that going to do? It'll just make the people there poorer, and that'll be that. Yeah, I saw some more hands before. Yeah. No, no, there's no such thing. So far, the polls are showing that Trump still has a considerable amount of support from all the people who voted for him. He didn't gain any support from people who didn't vote for him, but the vast majority of people who vote for him, they've changed their tune a little bit. Their tune is, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He must know what he's doing. Before, they said he knows what he's doing. Now they're saying he must know what he's doing. So there's a bit of a difference there, because they all can look at their own eyes and look at their own bank accounts or their own investment funds, and they see it's all gone down. So they can't say he knows what he's doing anymore. They say, well, he must know what he's doing. And he's saying, before he ran, you remember, he ran the election, says, I'm going to lower prices from day one. Now he's saying, you know what? We all have to suffer so that in the long run, things will be better. But of course, he never suffers, because he is who he is, right? But now he's saying, yeah, okay, it's medicine. He called what he calls the tariffs, he calls it medicine. And everybody needs to take medicine to get better. So America has to take medicine. But he's not taking the medicine, he himself. Someone else? Yeah. Yeah. So I missed the beginning of the question, really. Right. It's 3 months. It's 3 months. Yeah. Well, he's already declared a national emergency. And remember one important thing, that the United States is supposed to have three co-equal powers, right? The president, which is the executive, the legislative, which he now controls completely, and then there's the judiciary. The judiciary, in theory, is supposed to be able to act as a kind of a brake if necessary. But he appointed 3 judges out of 9, and that means right now the Supreme Court of the US has 6 conservative judges and 3 liberal judges. They're not doing much breaking. You know, they're giving him the benefit of the doubt. That's what's happening at this point. At this point, they're giving him the benefit of the doubt. They're saying, well, the president is using powers that every president used to have but never used them. So therefore, he's not going against what the Constitution intended. At this point, that's what they're saying. But they're starting to get a little, their hands are starting to shake when they sign those judgments. So they're starting to say, well, wait a minute, especially when you say, well, if I can fire a judge if I don't like his judgment, you know, on that score, they're all judges themselves. They say, hey, wait a minute, we could be next. So they said, no, you can't do something like that. So like I said, the Supreme Court are starting a little bit to wonder, where is all this going? But so far they have his back. On the deportations, they had his back. On the arresting people without warrants who are not citizens, they had his back. So those are important things that have really changed, you know, the whole idea of what protections American citizens have. And we haven't even gone into what the Canadian-American relationship and this idea of 30-day registrations, and the idea that you heard they stopped a woman for speeding and arrested her because she didn't have her passport with her. They said she was in the U.S. illegally because she couldn't prove otherwise. So the chill between Canada and the US is definitely getting to be wider and not narrower. Yeah. Yeah, he's not passing laws. He's making decisions. He on his own. Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Okay. Okay. So I understand. No, I understand the question. It's a good question. And the answer is really this, that the president does have some ideas in his mind that are fixed, and he has other ideas depending on the last person he spoke to. So it's a mixture of those two things. For sure, the president out and out lies when he promotes statistics to justify what he's doing, because the figures or statistics that he provides are very easily countered. But that doesn't matter to him. Another thing that we know for sure is the president will never admit that he made a mistake. So no matter what happens to the economy, no matter what happens, if it goes down, if unemployment goes up, he will say, it's definitely not my fault. It's one of two things. It's either Biden's fault because of the traps that he laid that will last for years in the US economy, or he'll say it's foreign countries' fault because they're trying to sabotage America's greatness. It'll never be his own fault. Um, so, sorry, hold on. Sorry. Gotta close this off. How do I do that? So that's the thing that will happen. But so he will tell people, that what's the saying goes, that it's sunny when it's raining. And remember that when in any kind of financial and in any kind of financial equation, that's why I said the finances are a bit less important. There's always going to be winners and losers. If you change one thing, it's going to benefit somebody and it won't benefit somebody else. So in a year from now, when everything is going down, he'll walk into a new car plant somewhere in Ohio and say, "Oh, look, we have a new car plant because of my tariffs." And he's right. There will be some changes like that. And he'll say, "This is what I worked so hard to get." But if any of you watch Bill Maher, I don't know if you're fans of his or not, But Bill Maher said, you know, what's this whole emphasis on manufacturing? Nowadays, in this day and age, manufacturing is not a great thing for a country. It's something that, I mean, like it's something that takes up less and less and less of a percentage of an economy, because we're in a knowledge-based economy. We're in an internet economy. We're in an artificial intelligence economy. What's this business about taking two pieces of metal and sticking them together? That's old school. Who's going to want to work in a factory, you know, making whatever money they make, you know, doing the same thing all the time, putting stuff in boxes? They have robots for that. Any kind of manufacturing that will end up in the US because of the tariffs won't employ a lot of people. It'll employ robots. Which country in the world has the most robots? China. Even in a country like China, where labor is not expensive, they have double the amount of robots than all the rest of the world put together, making stuff, because that's the way manufacturing is done cheaply these days. And China makes its own robots. So this whole idea of encouraging manufacturing is something from the 1900s. It's not something from the 2000s. So he's really off there. Yeah. Yes, Myrna. Right. Well, oh, okay. So you are absolutely right about that. In general, I would say like this, that you're absolutely right, that it's the Republicans and only the Republicans who can change the president's mind on anything. There was a motion that was voted on in the Senate, a phenomenal motion, which you probably know about. And it said that tariffs against Canada, this is only about Canada. Tariffs against Canada should expire in 60 days if the president cannot justify what these tariffs are all about, something like that. Yeah, that's right. So it passed in the Senate because several Republican senators, like the ones from Alaska, like the ones from Maine, Canada's neighbors, voted in favor of that, along with all the Democrats. But it would have to pass in the House. But here's the but that you didn't mention. It has to pass in the House, which it could. Theoretically, it could, because you only need a few American members of the House to change their votes for the Democrats to get a majority. But the president would veto it. The president would just say, I'm not signing this bill. And he's allowed to. But then the House and the Senate are allowed to override his veto. But you need a 2/3 majority in each house, which forget that. See, that's the problem. So yes, so in other words, it's not the voting that will change his mind, but it's people, his own strong supporters who can speak to him and say enough is enough. And they will only speak to him when their own constituents, like we're reading today, the farmers in North Dakota are saying, hey, wait a minute, all our fertilizer comes from Canada. Wait a minute, all the stuff that we grow is ending up in China. What are we going to do now? You know, those are the people who speak to their own elected representatives, who then go speak to Trump's secretaries, who then go speak to Trump. So it'll take a lot to change his mind, a lot. And I remember Melania once gave an interview. She said, one thing about Trump, if you hit him, he's going to hit you back twice as hard. And here, you know, she said that a long time ago. And here he's trying to hit China back twice as hard because he hit China first and they had the nerve to hit him back. You know, that's the thing. You know, his Secretary of the Treasury said it's a very stupid move if China retaliates. Okay, but doesn't that mean it's a stupid move that you started in the first place? Now, how about that, you know? So anyway, that's the crazy situation that we're living in. And because Canada is so dependent on the US, let me just finish by saying this. The 3/4 of the goods that Canada exports go to the US. Basically, we only have one market. And Mexico, by the way, the same thing. Everybody else in the world has lots of different choices. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the United States as a whole is such a big economy that trade matters much less to them as a percentage of their economy than it matters to many, many other places, including Canada. So the US has enough of a big domestic market. They have enough of a big manufacturing market that their imports or exports count for relatively little in the whole picture of things. So they won't suffer as much as a country like Canada, who, besides apples, like what else do we, like where do you think we get all of our, in season, where we get all of our produce comes from the States during the spring and summer type of thing. So we're not a big enough country to make our own tractors. We have to buy them from the States. We're not a big enough country to make our own airplanes. We have to buy them from the States. That's the problem that Canada has that the US doesn't have. So yeah, you wanted to say one more thing? Go ahead. Yes. Yeah, yes. Daniel Smith. Daniel Smith. Right. Yeah, right.
But it only lasts for a second, particularly uncomfortable because there was adamant that this is definitely not a one people. But suddenly they were saying.
Well, different times change different minds. But Daniel Smith is the premier of Alberta. Alberta has basically one industry, which is the oil and gas industry. Almost all of the oil and gas that comes out of Alberta goes to the US. And if the US is putting a tariff on, which they are, of 10%, what that means is that it's going to hurt the producers in Canada, because the US might just produce more to make up of what Canada was sending. The US could import more from other places like Venezuela, which they still import from, by the way, to make up that 10%. So she was going down because she's a conservative, and because she felt I have more in common with Trump than Trudeau did. She went down to try to use the soft touch, the good cop, bad cop idea. So she was the good cop, going to ask Trump to say, leave the oil and the gas industry alone, and we won't be so supportive of anything Canada does. Didn't work. Okay, didn't work. Didn't work. He didn't take off the tariffs on the oil and gas, so it didn't work. The other point that you made is very true, that Canada was starting to say, look, if we can't send our oil and gas to the US, there's a huge demand, especially for gas in Europe. All the gas that we produce is in BC and Alberta. Okay. Now, how are we going to get this gas to Europe? Well, we have to make a pipeline across the prairies, across Ontario, across Quebec, and build a liquefied natural gasification plant in the Saguenay, in Chicoutimi, to liquefy that gas. It's a huge multi-billion-dollar undertaking to build this gasification plant. And then once it's in a liquid form, ships can come right up the Saguenay River, pick up that gas, and go to Europe with it. There's unlimited demand. If that plant was there, ships would be lining up day and night to get it because they stopped buying gas from Russia. Where else are they going to get it from? The extra gas. They make their own, but they need more. So yes, there is a huge demand for that. And the Premier Legault, he said, yes, I'm in favor of it now. He didn't say that before, but now he's saying he's in favor of it. Let's hope it works out. That's what I'm saying. Let's hope it works out. The last thing, the filibuster that you were talking about wasn't a filibuster. It was a speech by, what's his name? Cory Booker. Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey. The Democrats in the United States are so disillusioned, they're so depressed over the election results that, he felt that, we have to do something to encourage them and to encourage the American people that there is another option. And he said, I'm going to speak in the Senate for 25 hours against Trump. And of course, it's not going to accomplish anything. Of course, there is nothing that's going to change because of it. But the morale of the opposition has to be brought up somehow. And he says, this is my way of doing it. And he is an excellent politician and a very intelligent person. And he also could be rehearsing for a leadership possibility in 4 years' time. He tried once, by the way, didn't make it very far. But he's a really, really good, intelligent person. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for staying extra time. And I'll see you all next week.